What's up, everybody? Selection Sunday is finally here, and in today's video, we're going to be discussing the bubble and predicting who's in the 2025 NCAA tournament and who's out. Let's jump into it. So looking at the current bubble picture, we'll be discussing a large group of teams in today's video, but I really think there are only 6 to 8 teams that are right there on the cut line. But to start, let's jump into the teams that I think are safely in the field. To start, we have our teams with the last 4 byes, and those are Oklahoma, Arkansas, Utah State, and Vanderbilt. Oklahoma has a record of 20-13 and predictive metrics around 43 for both the net and the BPI. They're led by their star freshman Jeremiah Fears and started off the season hot, winning their first 13 games before finishing 7-13 in their last 20. They have 7 quad 1 wins, 4 quad 2 wins, and only 1 loss in quad 3 and 4. So I think this team is safely in the field, also plays in a stacked SEC, which you'll see a theme in a lot of my teams in the last 4 byes. Next, we have Arkansas, and they're currently 40th in the net. They also have a record of 20-13 and really came on strong later on in the season. Coach Cal got that team right after a tough start to SEC play. Some of their big wins away from home include at Kentucky, Texas, and Vanderbilt, which Kentucky and Vanderbilt I think are both going to be safely in the field, but Texas is one of the ones that we'll be discussing a little later on. They also beat Michigan on a neutral court, which Michigan is playing in the Big Ten championship game, so that's a really good win. And then 2 other notable wins are Lipscomb and Troy, who both won their conference tournaments, so they're going to be in the field as well. So they actually had some decent non-conference competition. Next, we have Utah State, who just lost to Colorado State in the Mountain West semifinals in that conference tournament. They're 37th in the net and have a record of 25-7. I think they should be safely in the field, but some things to note is they do only have 2 quad 1 wins, and then they are 8-3 in quad 2. They're 15-0 in quads 3 and 4, so don't have any terrible losses, which is what I think will help the Aggies advance into the field. Then last week we have Vanderbilt, so our third SEC team that's getting in the last 4 byes. They're 48th in the net, 56th in the BPI, 20-12 on the season, and then have some really good wins, 5-9 in quad 1, 4-3 in quad 2. The thing that's really going to hurt Vanderbilt, and I think the committee might hold against them, is that non-conference strength of schedule. They're up in the 330s, which is one of the worst in the entire country, but they did beat 8 different SEC teams. So in conference play, they were able to get some big wins, especially the road win at Texas A&M. I think if they didn't get that win, they might be out of the field, but I believe this team is going to be safely in, but we could see them in Dayton. Moving on to my last 4 in, we see West Virginia, San Diego State, Indiana, and Xavier just getting in. Starting with West Virginia, they're 51 in both the net and the BPI, 19-13 on the season, had some big wins on the road. They won at Kansas and then also won versus Gonzaga and Arizona in the Bahamas earlier on. This is another team that had a really strong start to the season, but due to the Tucker DeVries injury that came later on, they started to struggle. I don't think the committee is going to hold that injury against them, but they could look to do so, so keep an eye out on that for West Virginia. They did take a bad loss in the Big 12 tournament to Colorado, which is one of the worst teams in that conference. However, they are 10-13 in quads 1 and 2. And then if you add quad 3 into that, they're 14-13. So I think West Virginia will be in the field. Then we have San Diego State, 52 in the net, 54 in the BPI, 20-9 on the season. They lost to Boise State in the Mountain West semifinals, but they do have some huge wins versus Houston, Creighton, and UC San Diego, 3 teams that are going to be in the field. Houston win was on a neutral court, and which is probably the best win that we see out of any of these teams that are in the bubble. So I think the Aztecs are going to be in, but again, another team that wouldn't be surprised if we saw them in the first 4. Then moving on to Indiana, they lost to Oregon in the Big Ten quarterfinals. This team is going to be right on the cut line. They're either going to be one of the last teams in or one of the first teams out. When we look at the committee and what they've done in recent years, their biggest questions they ask are, where did you play, who did you play, and how did you do? And we saw Indiana get a huge road win at Michigan State. Without this, I don't even think they're in this conversation or on this side of the bubble. They're 9-13 in quads 1 and 2, with 4-13 being just in the quad 1. They're 5-9 away from home, so they were able to pick up some wins on the road, and they did beat Ohio State twice, which is another team that we're going to be discussing. So I have the Hoosiers over the Buckeyes for sure. Then our last team in is the Xavier Musketeers. They lost in the Big East quarterfinals to Marquette, but they did have a huge win at Marquette earlier, which I think the committee is going to look on. Also wins versus UConn and Creighton at home. Xavier got on a hot streak to end the season, and in my opinion, Xavier has to be ahead of North Carolina, which is a team that we'll look at next. They're 12-0 versus quads 3 and 4, so didn't take any bad losses there. And then 1-9 in quad 1, 8-2 in quad 2. So although they didn't pick up many wins in that first quadrant, they don't have any bad losses and were able to finish the season strong in a tough Big East conference, so I have them as my last team in as of now. But if there are any bid stealers, specifically George Mason out of the A10 or UAB out of the American, I think Xavier is one of the first teams to get knocked out of the field. Then we have our first 4 out, which these are the teams that are just out of the field currently, in my opinion. That's Boise State, Texas, North Carolina, and Ohio State. Boise State, 44th in the net, 48th in BPI. They just lost to Colorado State in the Mountain West Championship game, and I currently have them as my first team out. 23-10 on the season. They were 3-6 in quad 1, 5-2 in quad 2. But the biggest things for me is that quad 3 and the quad 4 loss. That's really going to hurt them. They do have some big wins versus Clemson and St. Mary's in the non-conference, so did have a decent schedule there. Then obviously picked up some big wins in conference play with Utah State, beating New Mexico twice, and San Diego State. So unfortunately, I do have the Broncos as the last team out, but the committee could have a different opinion. Then we move on to a few teams that are very hard to gauge. Texas, they have great predictive metrics, 39th in the net, 34th in the BPI, but they have a record of 19-15. And for me personally, a team that has 15 losses is going to be really hard to get into the tournament. But then you look at their quad 1 record, and they have the most quad 1 wins out of anybody in the bubble, 7-10 in quad 1, 3-5 in quad 2. They have big wins versus Vanderbilt and Texas A&M, which are both going to be in the field. But my biggest issue is they're 12-15 in games that are quad 1 through quad 3, and they're under 500 in this metric, with history is not on their side when it comes to teams that are under 500 in this metric making the NCAA tournament. So I have the Longhorns on the outside looking in. Then North Carolina, the team with the best predictive metrics on the bubble, 36th in the net, 25th in the BPI, which would be one of the highest to ever be left out if they do, 22-13 on the season, but they only have one quad 1 win, 1-12 on the year. And if you subscribe to the quad 1A conversation, which is the upper echelon of quad 1 wins, they don't have any. Their only win in quad 1 is against UCLA. Then they have that tough quad 3 loss against Stanford at home. But then you look at their record on the road, and they're 10-9 away from home, so they do have an above 500 record there. And if this team was able to beat Duke in that semifinal matchup in the ACC, I think they're safely in. But without being able to get another quad 1 victory, I just don't see how you can put the Tar Heels in this. The biggest conversation we're going to hear about this, if the North Carolina does make the tournament though, is that the chairman of the committee is from UNC, so that is a storyline to keep watching. Then our last team in the first 4 out is Ohio State. They have a record of 17-15 on the season, so kind of have the same issues with the Buckeyes as I do with Texas, as those 15 losses, that is just way too many losses to get you into the NCAA tournament. But when you have a weak bubble like this one, they still are in the conversation, but I highly doubt that this team gets in. Also, a team getting an at-large bid that is only 2 games above 500 is extremely unlikely. However, they do have some big wins. They won at Purdue, but that one's not looking as good as it was. Also, a win versus Kentucky on a neutral court. But then they took 6 losses at home, including Northwestern and Pitt, 2 of the worst teams in the Big Ten. I just don't see how the committee can put the Buckeyes in over some of these other teams. So I think they're still going to be on the outside after Selection Sunday. And lastly, we have our next 4 out, which is where we see Wake Forest, UC Irvine, SMU, and then I listed George Mason because I do want to talk about the A10 a little bit at the end of this video. Wake Forest, 69th in the net, 62nd in the BPI with a record of 21-11. This was a team that was projected to make the NCAA tournament earlier on in the season, but struggled to end the year. 2-8 in quad 1, 6-1 in quad 2, and then 2 quad 3 losses. In a year where the ACC as a conference really struggled, I think this hurts Wake Forest, and unfortunately they're not going to be able to get into the tournament in my opinion. And then we have UC Irvine, who last night just lost in the Big West tournament finals to UC San Diego, so they were not able to get that automatic bid into the NCAA tournament. But UC Irvine has had an incredible season and deserves to be talked about, and I do think they're still in the discussion, but unfortunately I think they're on the outside looking in. They were 1-1 in quad 1, 3-2 in quad 2, and then 12-3 in quad 3. But with a record of 27-6, that is someone that definitely deserves to be talked about. They also lead the country with 17 wins away from home. They were 17-3 on the road this season, with 14 of those wins coming at other campuses and 3 wins at neutral sites. They did have that big win at UC San Diego, but unfortunately we're not able to get it done in the tournament finals. So I don't think we'll be seeing the Anteaters in the tournament, but they have had a great season for sure. Then we talk about SMU, which Andy Enfield in his first season with the Mustangs in the ACC was very impressive. 46th in the net, 45 in BPI. So they do have stronger predictive metrics than some of the other teams in this conversation. Also 23-10 is a better record, but they were 0-5 in quad 1 games, 6-5 in quad 2, 12-0 in quad 3, and 5-0 in quad 4. So no bad losses, but when you're 6-10 combined in quads 1 and 2, and especially with 0 quad 1 games, the committee really values teams that are able to actually have a chance to win in the tournament, and I just don't know if this SMU team brings that to the table. So I think the Mustangs are part of the next 4 out. And then lastly, we have George Mason, which is playing in the A10 championship game against VCU. They're 68th in the net, 70th in BPI, and they're one of our 2 bid stealers that are still available to steal a spot from someone in the bubble. They have a record of 25-7, and earlier on in the season, we were discussing this being a candidate for an at-large bid if they weren't able to win the A10, but I don't think that's able to be done anymore. However, if they do beat VCU and earn that automatic bid, VCU does have a better resume than a lot of these teams that were above. So when you think of the likes of Xavier or Texas, Boise State, North Carolina, it just gets a lot harder for those teams to make it in the field. But unfortunately, without a win in the A10 championship, I just don't see a way that George Mason makes it into the tournament. Let me know in the comments who you think is on the bubble and what teams do you predict to make it into the tournament and what teams do you think are going to be left out. Also, if you've been enjoying the content, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and turn on those post notifications, and we'll see you in the next one.